The views and opinions expressed on this platform are of me, myself, and I, not any agency I'm affiliated with. So please do not take what I say personally.
Today with myself on the podcast, I have Mr. the one and only Phil Klein. Phil has a doctorate in leadership / higher education, whichever one you want to call it, but he doesn't want to admit that. We're just going to throw that out there. He also has been a paramedic or rather, a firefighter medic for 30 plus years, or rather, just about 30, right?
No, it's I've been a firefighter for 32 years, so not that I do it anymore, but it was 32 years ago I earned my firefighter certification.
I mean, I'm not going to say it was a smarter decision, but no, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. Part of which he was a firefighter in New York and Georgia, which I think is really cool. Credentials also include firefighter lieutenant, where he also was an FTO, and quote, he did a lot of stuff. He wouldn't even go into the full detail because I was awestruck over the doctorate, but whatever. Currently, Phil resides in West Virginia because who doesn't love a little bit of John Denver?
It's true. He sang a great song. I don't think that song is about West Virginia, though. I think it's about Western Virginia. People just screwed it all up.
Fair enough.
You listen to the lyrics. It's true.
So, Phil, if you want to go ahead, introduce yourself, give a little bit of more detail, tell the people who you are and what you stand for.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's interesting to be a guest on a podcast since I do host my own podcast, and you were a guest on that one. That's actually how we got to know each other. My podcast is called Stories from the Road, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, I'm sure. But, I worked as a firefighter and a paramedic and had an EMS career. And about 10 years ago, I transitioned into higher education. So now I have the pleasure of leading programs. I got my start in higher education as a program director. I took over a failing EMS program. They were in trouble with the state. It was a big mess, and we got that whole thing turned around. And wouldn't you know it, my entire career has focused, or at least my higher education career has focused around either starting paramedic programs, EMS programs, or cleaning them up when I get there. So right now, like you said, I'm in West Virginia. I'm in the Northern Panhandle, which is the middle finger of West Virginia, and I'm working at a college here. And one of the first things I had to do was start a paramedic program. But I'm very proud that we have the only non-credit paramedic program in the state. So that means that you don't have to be a regular college student to get a paramedic credential. And I think while there's a whole lot of controversy over whether paramedics should have degrees or not have degrees, we looked at the area, we looked at the people, we had conversations, and we found out that most of the people that we're serving didn't want to go through the extra effort of getting a degree. We certainly have that option available for them, but we're able to get them in and out in 14 months. And in this area of the country, we are, like others, we are hit really hard with the paramedic shortage. So having that relatively fast program is certainly helping to grow this area, grow the paramedics, and grow EMS as a whole. So even though I work in higher education and do a whole lot of other stuff, I'm still sitting on a EMS program because that's what I always come back to.
So what actually made you get into this job? And if you want to start from like being a basic to being a medic, or I guess a firefighter in the mix as well. And then was there anything specific that drove you into the higher education aspect, or was it just like you saw a need, fill a need kind of setup?
So it's interesting because I was a little kid. I wanted to be a fireman because that was cool. But as I got older, I actually wanted to be a musician. And I found out early on you need talent to do that. Growing up on Long Island, I thought I was going to be the next Billy Joel, and I was very wrong about that. But I did actually teach myself how to play the piano, and I did play in bands. Never had one lesson, but got pretty good at it. I just didn't have the talent. So I guess like most 17, 18-year-old kids, I graduated high school with very little direction in my life. I thought about following in my dad's footsteps, maybe becoming an electrician, or I had for a moment thought about being an airplane mechanic. I was always good in my hands. I like working on cars and building things and that sort of stuff, but nothing really panned out. So I did what the rest of the folks in my high school class that didn't have an opportunity or didn't have the desire to go to a 4-year college or university. I went to the local community college. We called it 13th grade, and it's kind of what it felt like. So I sat in the back of Western Civ, and I was playing cards, and I realized you can't pass Western Civ if you're playing cards. And I remember I was pretty close to failing out at that point. And I was walking across the parking lot one afternoon. And out of the blue, I ran into a guy that I went to high school with. And he actually graduated the year before I did. And I hadn't seen him in forever. And he was like, "Hey, man, what's up?" And I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he goes, "Listen, I'm going to go to the firehouse tonight. I'm going to become a fireman." And it was all volunteer. And I said, "Well, that sounds like a good idea for you, but have fun." And he goes, "No, man." He goes, "You got to come with me. They have a big screen TV. They've got pool tables. They got a place to hang out, and they got beer." And I said, "All right, I'm in." So that night I went down to the firehouse and I met the guys and just started hanging out there. Before you can get voted in as a member, you've got to hang out. You've got to do your time. You've got to, figure out what that's all about. And I got voted in. And I think that night or the second night, or I was a firefighter, we caught a house fire. And I was with this crusty old firefighter, and he's like, "You stick with me, kid." And, we're going through the front door, and there's flames licking over our head. And, I'm scared to death, but I'm also, excited and thinking, man, this is awesome. This is the craziest thing I ever did. And I loved it. I fell in love with being a firefighter. That night, I fell in love with it. But I was fortunate because we used to run ambulances out of the firehouse that I was at. And without any medical training, if they were shorthanded, so if they had an EMT or an advanced EMT paramedic, they would take a helper. So every once in a while, I got to ride as a helper. And I would see like a heroin overdose, and they would wake somebody up with Narcan. I thought, man, that is really cool. I want to learn how to do that. But the rule at the time was you had to be a firefighter for a year before they would send you to EMT school. And I didn't want to wait. So I'd already failed out of community college and said, you know what, I'm going to go to EMT school. And Jeff, the guy that got me to join the firehouse, he said, "I'm going to go with you." So we found a EMT program at LaGuardia Community College. It was a night program, and the two of us paid the $500 or whatever it was, and we were on our way. And we became EMTs. And I was 18 years old when I became an EMT. So I did that for, I guess, about a year or so. And then North Shore Hospital. Let me back up just a little bit, because Long Island's an interesting place because most of the firehouses are all volunteer. So nobody becomes a paramedic. They all became these, I think they were called EMTCCs or advanced EMTs. It's kind of similar to what the advanced EMT is now. It was probably a little more liberal with skills, but it was heavily controlled by medical control. So you could shock somebody, but you had to send a strip first. And you could intubate somebody, but you had to ask medical control to do it. So everything was heavily controlled by medical control. So when the paramedic program came out, a paramedic's a paramedic, and paramedics typically worked in New York City. And I said, maybe I'd like to work in New York City. So I signed up for paramedic school. I went to the open house, and I'm convinced to this day that the only reason I got into paramedic school is because my parents said that they would pay the $3,500 for the program. And there was a line on the application, and if I remember right, it said something along the lines of, how do you intend to pay for this program? And I wrote, my mom and dad said they would write a check. And I could actually send you a picture of the acceptance letter and the whole thing, but my mom wrote the check number down. But, in all honesty, they got off pretty cheap because the only college they paid for me was that and one semester of community college, which I squandered. So a year later, I become a paramedic, and I'm the youngest paramedic in New York State. And I absolutely loved it. And there's a really funny story. So Jeff and I got in a lot of trouble when we were firefighters, but we were in the hospital. We just run a call, and I think I was riding the PCR, and he was doing something else. And one of the older guys, he's probably in his 50s at the time, and he had been firehouse for 30 years, and he's making up the stretcher. And he stops for a second, and he goes, "I'm the senior man here. Why am I making up the stretcher?" And Jeff, without missing a beat, walks past him and says, "Because I'm a paramedic," and just kept on going. And that was probably the first salvo in the war. So a little later that year, I transferred to Engine Company 3 because I wore out my welcome and rescue, because we were the only two paramedics in the department at that point, and we were kids. I was barely 21, and I think Jeff was a year older than me. So we were kids, and all these guys that had been around forever, all of a sudden when we went on calls, like we were the guys in charge. We were the highest medical authority on the scene. So. And being cocky and, being in our 20s, we certainly exploited that. So, it was just one of those things. But that's how I got into EMS, and that's how I got into the firehouse. Higher ed's a different story. Long Island is traditional firefighting, right? We had a great time down there. We We were right next door to the FDNY. I was in Nassau County, so we had a lot of FDNY firefighters that were volunteers. So we learned traditional firefighting, truck company work, engine company work. We had old structures. We were able to go onto roofs. We cut holes in roofs. We did all this stuff. And then I moved down to Georgia. Everything's new construction, and God bless those guys, because it's tough to fight fire in new construction because you really have very little time. And once the roof goes, you're done. Building loses integrity, that sort of thing. But it was just never the same feel. And I used to dub it the corporate fire department because that's what it felt like. It felt like we were working for a corporation, not a traditional fire department. So while I love the guys and I love the job, I didn't really appreciate the leadership. And my second job was always an instructor. So when I had the opportunity I was working as an adjunct, and another college called up and they said, do you have anybody that can be an EMS program director? And unfortunately, I had gone back to college at that point. I had earned a bachelor's degree. And my boss at the college said, yeah, this guy can do it. And really the deciding factor for me was that I doubled my salary by going from the fire department to higher education. And with 3 kids, one playing travel baseball, making that kind of financial leap was certainly worth it. But it seems like I've tried to kind of inch my way back in one way or another. And I think doing the podcast that I do now is my way of sort of staying connected to being a first responder and talking about things that are important. But that's my story. That's how I ended up where I am. And, I might trade some of it. I might not, but I'm here and I gotta play the cards I'm dealt.
So sounds like a lot of good, just open doors along the way, which I feel like is how a lot of people in leadership get there. Just doors open up, you're available, and you're ready to facilitate that role. But I do want to ask, so I know about your podcast, Stories from the Road. It's phenomenal. 20 out of 10 recommend. It's why I had you on. But tell me about Stories from the Road in general, especially for the listeners. Like, what motivated you to even want to start it up? What is the goal for the podcast? Because it has the mission you have behind it and the passion you have for it it's astounding, and I love it. And like I've told you before, like, I've benefited from it and just the experience from other people. So tell me about it. Tell me its origins, if you will, and like, where do you see it going?
So I think the podcast is very reflective of my life in the sense that it went somewhere that I never expected it to go. And if you paid attention a little while ago when I told you my story, I am somewhere where I never expected to be. When I was a firefighter in Georgia, we had just a tradition. We were double house. We had a truck and an engine and an ambulance, and we were right in the middle of downtown Lawrenceville, about a mile away from the courthouse where Larry Flint was shot. But we would always sit in the back of the firehouse. We'd open the bay doors. We'd let the breeze blow through in the evenings when it cooled off a little bit. And we would tell stories. And firefighters tell stories. We're so good at it. We embellish. It's kind of like fishing stories, but we're really good at telling those stories. And, I was talking to somebody the other day, and he brought up a good point. He said, it's so important to keep telling these stories because the profession is... it's built upon tradition, right? So you've got to keep telling the stories to keep the traditions alive. And for us, we would sit around and just talk about old fires, or we talk about, we really talk about anything, but, sooner or later, somebody was talking about a call or talking about a fire or talking about this incident that they ran. And I thought, man, what a great idea for a podcast. What if I got some of my old buddies together and, we went on a podcast and we just told some firefighter stories. And that was all it was ever supposed to be. And then I lined up a couple of guests. It was about a year ago that I started this work, but I lined up a couple of guests, and the first one was a guy named Thomas that had retired, and he and I had known each other for years. He was from a different department, and we start talking. And Thomas starts telling me about how he retired, and now his hypervigilance is relaxed. And he tells me how he's driving past this street where there was a car wreck 20 years earlier, and he starts seeing ghosts. He starts seeing the ghosts of the people that were killed in that car wreck. And I don't mean it like it's haunted, but it's coming back to him, and he's remembering that auto accident. And he's driven past that road, probably hundreds of times, and it never really affected him, but this day, for some reason, it did. And that fundamentally changed the direction of my podcast. All of a sudden, what started out as us getting together and sharing some stories became a discussion about mental health and first responders. And I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't trade it for the world because I think the conversations that we're having are so important. So, if you ask where I want this podcast to go or what I want to do with this, first of all, I want to create a community. And I think I'm doing that to a certain extent. At least I'm doing my fair share. Anybody that listens to the podcast, anybody that comes on the podcast and tells a story, we can all relate to those stories. And whether it's a call that Thomas ran or a call that somebody else ran, I have a call in the back of my mind that was similar. Maybe not the exact same details, but it was that car wreck where I knew somebody. It was that baby where the mother handed it to me. It was, that house fire where we crawled down a hallway to pull somebody out. They're all these similar calls, but they're being told by different people, and we've all shared these experiences and then the aftermath. So for me, I think what I want to get out of the podcast and where I eventually want it to go is I want to build this community where people understand they can come on here and they can talk about it and they can listen to stories and they can realize that they're not alone. And a good example of that is the current paramedic program. So my paramedic program director is a phenomenal lady, and she loves the podcast, and wherever she goes, she hands out my cards and stuff. And, really, she's like my marketing person. But she shared my podcast with her class. And there was a guy in the class who was really struggling. He had some difficult calls. And a couple of folks in the class said, you need to listen to this podcast. You need to realize that it's not just you. You're not the only one. And that particular person listened to it and recognized that he's in this field, but he's certainly not in this field alone. And other people are going through exactly what he was going through. And it's okay to ask for help. I mean, that's another key point of what I'm doing is letting people know that, we all have these demons that we face. We're seeing things day in and day out that the human mind is not designed to see or to deal with. So it's okay to ask for help. So that's where the podcast is now. That's where we're going. I'm getting ready to start recording season 5. I'll release that after the new year. I'm just slugging away at it. If it ever goes anywhere beyond that, that's great. But that's really not the mission. The mission is just to create that community. And I hope I'm doing a good job of that.
I can attest. You definitely are. Especially like the people that you have on. It's like I feel like I know them by the end of the episode. And it's like you said, it's that community of people who are just kind of like, we're all bound together by this job. But when you start telling your stories and like you're like your whole point, you start relating to those calls and those instances. I don't know. It binds together us as a whole, if that makes sense.
I think it does. And that's that sense of community that I'm trying to build. We're all in this together. We all have those demons and we can lean on each other if we have to.
So I do want to ask, is it hard listening to these calls? Because like the episode that I was on, if you want to go back and listen, it'll help me and Phil. But it's 2 floors up. But I talked about my call, and I kind of related it to my dad before. And like my mom listened to it, and she said she was crying. And I don't know if it's just because like it hit her at a home level or what. But like there are episodes you put out that I'm like I feel it in my stomach. I'm like, but you have to listen to every single one of them and then edit them. And like when you go back, I'm sure you understand, when you go back and edit an episode, like you hear it all over again and you have to hear the whole thing. And then I don't know about you. When one of my episodes released, I listened to it like on my phone just to see how it sounds. But anyways, you got to listen to every one of those. Does that wear on you a little bit? Because I feel like it would be a lot.
So it does. And I didn't recognize that it was wearing on me. So I started this, I think I released the first episode in February. And throughout the year, I've had my moments. And, I've never been diagnosed, but I'm certain that I have PTSD, just like anybody else that did this job for as long as we have. I don't think it affects me the way you think it does. So I disconnect from it when I'm in the middle of doing the podcast, in the sense that I listen to it when I'm editing. It's a technical process. I'm not even really listening to the podcast again. There are calls that get to me. There are calls that, when I listen to somebody talk about, I'm like, man, that was a great job. And, I'm really proud of what this person did. And I'm honored that they allowed me to share their story. So my connection to it is there, but I don't let it bother me. I've been really good at compartmentalizing for all these years. And like I said, it did get to me a little bit. And I've gotten to a place now where I've kind of gotten past that. And now it's a technical process for me. I don't listen to the podcast once it's edited. In fact, I don't even listen to an episode all the way through. I edit it. Once I get to the end, I'm done editing it. I render it and send it off, and that's it. And I never listen to it again. So if there's an error in there, let me know, because I didn't hear it. But I put it out, and I kind of think of it like a musician, right? So you put out an album or something. I don't know that a musician sits there and when their song comes on the radio and they listen to it, they probably turn the station and listen to something else. And I do listen to a lot of podcasts, but I just never listen to mine once it's done. It's out there. But what I will tell you is what is really rewarding and what really, I guess, gets to me, or really makes me appreciate the work that I'm doing, is when somebody reaches out and says, hey, I listened to that episode and, it helped me, or it helped me relate to something, or I had a call just like that, or, I was driving cross country with my dad and we got a little closer because we listened to your podcast. It's those kinds of messages that really mean a lot to me. And it's, like you said before, I did a lot of stuff, and there were times in my career when I had some, really crazy calls and got some recognition for it, and that was great. And I never really cared. So I never really cared about the certificates or, the bars or any of those things. But what always meant something to me is if I received a handwritten thank you note. Hey, you came and, it was a terrible thing happened, but you were really kind to my family, and I really appreciate you for doing that. Like, that's what meant something to me, and that's the folder that I still keep of the handwritten letters. Those are the things that mean something to me. So even with the podcast, it's not so much that it's out there that it's doing well. I mean, I watch downloads and I'm like, we're having a good week. But the bottom line is when I get a message on Instagram or, whatever social media platform somebody reaches out on and says, that episode really spoke to me, then I know that I'm doing the right thing. And then to me, the work that I'm doing matters when I get those sort of, that sort of response to it.
A lot of the kind of internal motivation and internal reward is, I feel like, what's going to sustain more so than like the accolades, if that makes sense.
No, it does. But I also think that's part of being a first responder, right? We don't make any money. We're certainly not doing it for, the fabulous lifestyle that we have. We do it because it means something to us internally. It's that drive that we have to help people. And I think that's what keeps us on this job, or gets us into this job and then keeps us on this job, is the ability to make a difference in someone's life. Even in higher education, whenever I interview for a job or talk to somebody about the work that I do, the most important thing that I bring up is that I want to be able to make an impact. I'm in Wheeling, West Virginia. There's very few places in the country you can make an impact like you can make one here. And we're doing it. My division is killing it, and I'm very proud of that. We are making a huge impact as far as getting people back to work, getting them trained, but that's important to me. And that's always been important to me in my life, is whatever kind of work I did, I wanted to impact other people's lives when I did it.
Very good. Also want to give a shout out to you for making me sound arrogant for listening to my own episodes. So thank you for that.
No, not at all. Everybody has their own way of doing it. I just hate listening to my own voice, so I won't even listen to this one.
Because I love listening to mine. Anyways, so tell me real quick, if someone wanted to submit their own call, what's the link? Because I already know, but our listeners probably don't know. So go ahead, share what's the link, where do I go? Guide us along the way.
I think the easiest way to find me is storiesfromtheroadpodcast.com, or on Instagram, Stories from the Road Podcast with an underscore in between each word. And then I'm on Twitter, I think it's STFR _podcast. So we're out there, but storiesfromtheroadpodcast.com will take you to all the links, and you'll be able to find the podcast. You can listen from there, and there's actually a link on the website that says "Be a guest on the podcast." And you can click it, schedule a time to do an interview. There's some information about how to do it. It really is a simple process. I mean, you did it, and it really was. And we just had a conversation. That's all it is a conversation, and doesn't take very long. I love telling people stories, or letting people tell their own story, and just kind of being the facilitator for that. I'm pretty good at dragging some items out. If I have to, I can ask some questions. But for the most part, I sit back. It's not my story. I'm just the host, and I open up the mic, and I really just enjoy listening to people and appreciate people telling their stories and sharing them.
I'm also going to have in my link tree, I'm going to have the link to that website that Phil was talking about. So also be on the lookout for that. Before we get to the standard questions I ask in every interview, if I was going to ask you to share a story, like your own story that would be on the show, go ahead and give me that if you're willing to. Obviously, you run the show.
Well, I'm going to call you out because in season 1 I did share a story, and it was a tough
Okay,
one.
but not dude, I know, but still.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about this. The next story that I would share, it's an interesting one. I think it's interesting for a lot of reasons. But to give you the quick version of it, I was on the ambulance. My lieutenant was driving me that day, and we got a call for a brush fire. And we didn't really think much of it. I think we were leaving the hospital, and it wasn't too far. And my lieutenant hated being on the ambulance, so he's like, "Let's go to the brush fire." I said, "All right, Jimmy, let's go." So, so Jimmy and I go to this brush fire, and we get there probably the same time the engine in the truck got there, and it was a good brush fire. And then we realized we had somebody burned in a field; their entire body was burned up. So we grabbed the guy. I asked the battalion chief to call a helicopter for me because the burn center is Grady, which is a good 45 minutes away. And he said, "No dice, Klein. They're not flying today." I said, "Well, all right. Let's John Wayne it and throw him in the back of the ambulance and see what we can do." So here's the scenario. I got a rookie that jumps in with me. I've got a guy that's burned probably 70 to 80% of his body, and I've got a lieutenant who hates being on the ambulance driving. None of us know how to get to Grady. Right, because I'm a paramedic, so I always have an EMT driving me, so I don't pay attention. I mean, I know about where it is. Jimmy's never on the ambulance, so he has no idea, and the rookie's useless. So we just know to get on 85, and we're heading south. So I'm calling my buddy who's a Grady paramedic. I give my phone to Jimmy, and he's kind of talking him in. So we've got, now at least we know where we're going. We can't get a line on this guy, so I owe him. And I think the order I got from medical control was give him morphine until he stopped breathing, which is about what I did. So I dumped the entire drug box of morphine on him. I then made a second call to medical control, but I called Grady because we were too far away from our medical control. And I said, I'm out of morphine. I got some fentanyl. You want me to try that? So they said, yeah, go ahead and give him. So I gave this guy the drug box, essentially. And my rookie was just pushing it, which is probably illegal in like 9 states, but I don't care. I was watching the airway. So we get down to Grady. And here's the thing. We were county guys at that time. Now I was a New York City medic, so I never really cared about, this. And the Grady guys, they do a tough job. They are the busiest, medics, but they always kind of gave you the eye when you came, and you're like, your fancy little uniforms and your nice ambulances that aren't beat the snot. And, when I opened the door, I had like 3 Grady medics pulling this guy out for me. Like, that's how serious this call was. We put all the differences aside, and we were just one team getting this guy into the hospital. So we get him in, we get all cleaned up, and we drive back up to the county. And, I don't think too much about it. It was kind of funny because I went to get orders signed for the narcotics that I just gave, and everybody was gone. So the doctor that gave me the order from my side of medical control was gone, and the doctor from Grady I couldn't find. So I gave all these narcotics and never got a signature on it. I had to call my lieutenant, my EMS lieutenant. He had to bring me a new drug box, and I'm like, "Listen, I didn't get anything signed." He's like, "Yeah, I think we'll be all right. Don't worry about it." So the joke was how much narcotics did Klein give this guy, and the joke was he gave all of it. But anyway, so that night, and this was probably about 1 or 2 in the afternoon. So that night, we're sitting at the firehouse watching TV and minding my own business, and 2 detectives show up to the firehouse. And I'm like, well, this is interesting, and they want to talk to me. So surely it's not about the narcotics, because I think we squared that away. And they asked me, did he say anything to you? And I said, no, he didn't say anything. He wasn't really talking. He was moaning a lot, but he wasn't really talking a whole lot. And they said, well, the story is the guy was just released from the Gwinnett County Jail. He was a pedophile, and he doused himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire. And they weren't sure if he had lit himself on fire or if somebody had lit him on fire. And I said, oh, well, that changes things a little bit. And the reason why that call stands out to me is because I would like to think that if I had known his history, I would have done the exact same thing that I did, which is dump an entire drug box on him. But I'm a father of 3, and I don't like pedophiles. So I don't know what I would have done. But I always use that call as an example of doing the right thing no matter what. And in this case, I didn't know any better, so I did what I thought was right and what I believed was right. And I hope I would have made the same decision if I had the opportunity, but I can't say for sure that I would have. But that would have been one of the calls that that I would end up telling.
Whew, man, I'm kind of with you though. If, like you said, knowing his history and then still having to look at him and like justify this is a human being, let alone one that's in pain and whatever, versus like knowing what he's capable of. That's a hard call, man. That's hard.
It is, but I used to use it as a teaching tool all the time. I would do a class on ethics, and that was one of the questions that I would always ask. I would give them a scenario. Here's the situation. Here's the patient. Here's what you did. And if you had the opportunity, would you want to know or would you not want to know? And I'd let them,
Yeah.
the students, have that conversation. I think it's important to think about. And again, you'd like to think that no matter what, you would treat the person to the best of your ability. You're not God. You're not the person to judge them. But deep down inside, you're kind of glad he's suffering a little bit too. So it's but it's also, it's what we see, it's what we deal with, right? You get a guy that is shot by the police and he just shot a cop. You still got to treat him. You don't get to make those decisions. So there's, it's just, this job is not easy, and some of the decisions that we make aren't easy. And I think that's a good example of those difficult decisions that we have to make.
Absolutely. And honestly, I would go as far as to say that sometimes it's the difficult decisions, not of like what medication am I going to push, or can I remember the pediatric dose for this. It's having to take that judgment and that bias, and I mean, in a situation like that, your own ethics and morals, and put them to the side, because at the end of the day, every patient deserves the best we can give them. But like for me, it was the drunk driver who killed a family of four, and you still have to treat XYZ and you have to treat his pain, but you know that like it's just not fair. And that's one of the hardest parts about this job, honestly. It's one, we can't control fate, and two, we can't control what other people have done, but now we're here to like clean up the problem, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think those difficult decisions aren't just the ones where you want someone to, or you think somebody should suffer a little bit. One of the things that would always drive me crazy as a medic is when I would show up on scene and there's some 85-year-old, woman in a hospital bed in the living room, and the family is searching frantically for a DNR, and there's, 3 firefighters doing CPR. And like, well, we can't pronounce it because there's no CPR. There's no DNR. We've got to do CPR. We can't pronounce, and I would just very slowly just push them out of the way and say, we're just going to let this one go. And
Yeah.
that is, probably as well as I do, that is a difficult thing for medics and for EMTs especially to do, is to stop doing CPR, because they feel like, no, our job, we've got to do CPR. There's no DNR. The rule says we have to do CPR. And the rule says you've got to care for people. You've got to care for people and their families. And doing CPR on an 85-year-old cancer-ridden woman in her living room is not caring for anybody. And I'm sure there are people listening now that'll disagree with me, and we're going to get sued and all this stuff, but I've been doing it for 30 years and I haven't gotten sued yet. So maybe I'm just lucky.
Nobody's going to come for you, because I stand wholeheartedly for this. And if anybody's going to come for anybody, it's me. And I'm ready. Come at me. Guns blazing. Let's go.
Oh, boy.
But
Here we go.
no, but in that situation, like the best patient care, I mean, honestly, as morbid as it is the stopping and giving that act of mercy, because dude, it's a reason why I low key want a DNR, because it is so brutal. And if it's somebody's time, like, I hate to say it this way, but don't take that from them. And like, we do save lives. CPR does save lives, and intubating saves lives, and the myriad of things we do, it saves lives. But dude, in those very, very, very special circumstances, sometimes it just, like you said, it's that moment of like, big picture. Yeah, I know we're supposed to, but like, let's think about this, especially when the family's already, they know the DNR is there. They just can't find it in that moment, because they're already under that stress. They're already grieving through the process, like unexpectedly in that moment. And now it's, yeah, it's hard. It is very hard.
It is. It absolutely is.
And as a good segue, look at that. What what actually keeps you going in EMS? Because 30 years, especially in the lifetime of somebody in EMS, that's a that's a length of time. Not to make you feel aged. But what keeps you going and what helps like prevent burnout for you? Like what makes you wake up and say, I still want to do this and I'm gonna do this and I'm not gonna quit right now?
So I think my role in EMS has changed dramatically, right? So I'm not a provider anymore. I don't ride an ambulance. I'm not in a fire truck, and I miss it every day. I miss being that person because you know as well as I do, it's not just what you do; it becomes a part of you. It's who you are. So for me, I stay connected to EMS by creating great training programs. And while that probably doesn't sound as glamorous or as exciting as being on the back of a truck, I think it's just as important. And what I tell my folks that teach in those programs is, listen, I'm an administrator. I'm a vice president at a college. My job is not to tell you how to teach a program. And I give my program director a lot of credit because she came into a program knowing that I was a paramedic and I was a paramedic program director and had great success rates. And she had to teach a program under me. And it would be really easy for me to tell her, you're going to do the program this way. You're going to use, this book, and you're going to do it like this, and you're going to do it like that. And I go out of my way to say, absolutely not. This is your program. You do what you want to do. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask me. And she does every morning, 7:30 in the morning. I get to work, and there she is. Hey, Phil, I want to ask you something. I'm like, just do it. It's your program. Just do it. I don't care. Not that I don't care, but I'm not going to make the decision for you. It's your program. Run it the way you want to run it. It's not my program anymore. Like, my job now, and I tell her all the time, my job is to get obstacles out of your way. That's all my job is. Right. So, if we have a problem with the purchasing department and we can't buy a book or a tablet or something that we need, I'll go fight that battle. You teach the students, you take care of that. So for me, that's how I stay connected. And I really do enjoy it. And we have this great relationship, me and Linda, because, she does. She asks me questions every day. And it's almost like she wants my validation. And my answer to her is, whatever you think is right is probably right. And, if you make a mistake, I promise I can fix it. Just do what you want to do. And then, I think even when I was a medic, I didn't hang out with medics. I went to work. I worked my 24 hours, and then I did something else. And I hung out with my kids. I coached a lot of baseball. I hung out with people that, had nothing to do with the fire department or the police department. I mean, I knew cops, I knew firemen, but for the most part, I didn't make it a point to go hang out with those guys. I did things on my own. Most of my friends weren't involved as a first responder. And I'm fortunate that I had a group of friends that knew better than to ask me about work. Sometimes, hey, we heard there was a big fire yesterday. What happened? I could, I'll tell them what happened, but I didn't get those stupid questions like, hey, what's the worst thing you ever saw? Or, tell me about it. I heard the guy got shot the other night, tell me what that looked like. And, for the most part, those guys just kind of left me alone. And I was very grateful for that because no one wants to talk about those calls. And sometimes you have to educate folks and just tell them never ask that question. In fact, I did a newspaper or a magazine interview, and that was one of the things they asked me. They said, if you can give advice to somebody listening to your podcast that knows first responders, what would that advice be? And my response was, just don't ask. Ask them how they're doing, ask them how the job's going, but don't ask them about what they actually do because they don't want to talk about it. And honestly, you don't want to hear about it.
Very true. Like you kind of touched into, I was going to ask how you balance like your work and personal life. You touched into that a little bit. Tell us how you decompress because I am always looking for all of the answers to that one.
So I said it before, and I still am. I'm really good at compartmentalizing. So when I left work, I left work at work. I didn't talk to my wife about it. I didn't talk to my kids about it. I kept it, kind of all in here, which probably is not the smartest thing to do. But you have to remember, I started this in 1990. Things were a little bit different back then. So, or 1992, I should say. But things were very different back then. So, I know you weren't born yet. Anyway, so for me, it was, and I got that advice when I was in paramedic school. My paramedic instructor, Bob Muser, was a great guy. And, he said, don't hang out with first responders. Don't hang out with other paramedics. Hang out with normal people. It'll be good for you. And he was 100% right. So, my friends were most of my friends, over the last 20 years were guys that I coached baseball with, whether it was, one of my boys playing or the guys that I coached on my team. We're all baseball guys. So, we drank together and we watched our kids play ball together and we laughed a lot and we did a lot of stupid stuff, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the job that I was doing. So, and I'm grateful for that. And so it really was a disconnection from the work that I did to have friends that had absolutely nothing to do with it. And again, were considerate in how they approached the work that I did. So that was really how I decompressed, was just, I got out on the baseball field. I hung out with my kids. I watched them grow up. I taught them. We would travel the country and go see different baseball stadiums. That was my outlet. Other things I did, I'd go run, I'd go mountain biking, just do some physical exercise. I think I put an Instagram post up the other day. I went for a run and it was a beautiful day. It was like 70 degrees here in West Virginia in November, which is fantastic. And I went for a 4-mile run and I hadn't done that in a while and I felt really good. And it's important. It's important to get that exercise. It's good for your head. It's good for your body, but it's also good for your head to just do something. So those are some of the ways that I decompress. And I know other guys do different things, but for me, that was the things that I enjoy doing.
Gotta agree with the running part, even though it physically hurts. I believe in the power of cardio, especially like you have your rage rooms and stuff. Like there are times whenever you need to get a lot of that built up, pent up, whatever out. But like, especially when you keep it consistent, running is the best medicine. Absolutely, hands down. What would you say is your favorite type of call? And you have so many. You have respiratory, cardiac, trauma, psych. You have your cardiac arrest. You have your endocrine systems, adrenal crises. What you got for your favorite type?
I will take a good car wreck any day of the week. And I know trauma is, trauma, all the medics are like, we prefer medical calls because it helps us think. That's a bunch of crap. Give me a good trauma any day of the week. Get my blood pumping. I want to see a car just twisted and we've got to cut people out. Those were always the calls that I found exciting. Everybody gets excited about shootings and all that stuff, and that's fun, but it's a whole. I always thought good car wrecks just to, I don't know, maybe I was just fascinated by what cars can do when there's enough force acting on them. But I was a good medic. I did my share of medical calls, and I could figure out what was going on most of the time, and it was fine. But if we were going to a car wreck, I was excited.
I do have to disagree. I love a good medical, especially respiratory, but I do agree that car wrecks, okay, going to them stresses me out because they're 9 times out of 10, it's going to be 0 or 100. And some of the worst car, like damage wise, some of the worst ones I've ever seen have been when the patient is up and walking around. You check their vitals, you watch them for a couple of minutes, and they really are perfectly fine. And it is the wildest thing. So I do agree. I do love a good car wreck, not going to lie.
And just to add to that, I don't want the person walking around. I want somebody that I've really got to do some work on. I mean, I want a good trauma, but I want it from a car wreck. I don't want the falls and I don't want the shootings. I want the good car wrecks. We got to cut them out. They're in bad shape. We've got to keep them alive. Those are the ones that I really like because they make you think like a good medical call does, but there's also a lot more involved in those extrication calls. For me, I don't know. That's if I was getting up at 2:00 in the morning, I need somebody pinned in a car.
Some of us don't wish harm on others, so okay.
I don't wish harm. I just want to be there when it happens. There's a difference.
Fair. That's fair.
I'm not a monster. I just want to be there. Just like a house fire. I don't ever want to see someone's house burn, but if it's going to burn anyway, let it happen in my first in.
Okay, justification is on point. Speaking of crazy calls and car wrecks and whatnot, what is the craziest or the funniest call you've ever had?
So I don't know if it's crazy. It's probably a little funny, but I think it is a good example of there's a saying and it says we don't define the service. Our job is to provide the service. So we got a call for an upset stomach. I think is what the call came over as, and we went there. And when we got to the house, there was a woman who had some stomach issues, and she had clogged every toilet in her house. And she wanted to go to the hospital because she ran out of toilets. So
Oh my
rather
God.
than take her to the hospital, we became plumbers and we unclogged her toilets for her. And she was very grateful that we did that. But that was one of the funnier calls that I ran. That she needed us to unclog her toilets.
I'm glad you said that quote in the beginning, because if you wouldn't have said that, I would have been like, oh my God, people make me so sick. But because you said that, I'm like, oh, you're right. Um, what is a piece of advice you give to someone either going into EMS, someone already in EMS, someone questioning, like, do I even want to keep doing this? What is some advice that you have in your momentous vault of wisdom?
So I think the best advice that I can give really any medic, whether they're new or they've been around for a while, and probably the newer they are, the more the supplies, is don't let anybody, I don't care who they are, don't let anybody dictate how you treat a patient. And I'll give you a good case in point. So when I was working, I guess I was riding on the fire truck because I wasn't on the ambulance that day, and we got a call for a shooting. And when a shooting comes out, especially when you don't get a lot of shootings, people lose their minds. And the day that this shooting came out, there was a guy riding as a battalion. He wasn't a battalion chief. He was a captain, but he was riding up. And we beat him there. And we get to this call. This guy was holstering his gun, apparently, and he shot himself in the leg. It's questionable what really happened. We thought he might have been seeking medication. We're not really sure. But he had a hole in his leg. Not a big deal. He wasn't going to die. It wasn't a terrible gunshot. Like I said, I started my career in New York City. I've seen a couple of gunshots. It's really doesn't do a whole lot for me. And we had a good crew, so it was not a big deal. So we got the guy out of the house. We got him into the back of the ambulance, and we were trying to get an IV on him. And Captain Chaos, the guy that was riding as the battalion chief, he gets to the back of the ambulance, and I guess he heard somebody say, we can't get an IV. We're having trouble getting an IV. And he says, this man needs to be in Trendelenburg, which is where you lift the back of the stretcher up, the feet of the stretcher up. And he proceeds to lift that stretcher up. And this guy yells in pain because now we've hurt his leg where he's shot. And I very politely said, Captain, we don't need to do that. And I put the stretcher back down. He said, I said this man needs to be in Trendelenburg. And I said, we really don't. And this is right around when the research came out that said Trendelenburg doesn't really do anything. So, he insisted, and I wouldn't let him do it. I wouldn't let him put the guy in Trendelenburg. I wasn't going to let him dictate patient care because he had captain bars on the side of his shirt. And eventually we got the line, we closed the back of the door. I got off the ambulance because I wasn't riding on the ambulance that day. I was on the engine. And in the middle of the street, he proceeded to, go up one side, down the other, screaming at me, when I tell you to do something, you're going to do it, blah, blah, blah. And I knew I was right. Didn't help me at the time, but I knew I was right. But I didn't let him dictate patient care based on his rank in the fire department. And it's a difficult thing to do. I had a lot of experience behind me. I was a well-respected medic in the department. I was a good firefighter in the department. And, this guy was not going to intimidate me. But I think that is really difficult for a new medic to stand their ground when they know they're right. And somebody else, whether they're an old medic or they're a police officer or they're a battalion chief or a captain or even a lieutenant, telling them how to do something based on their rank rather than their ability. In the end, I was vindicated. My battalion chief, when he came back to work 3 days later, tore this guy a new one, and rightfully so. But there's a lot of examples out there. Right? I think there's the Colorado example where a couple of medics have been charged with murder. For giving ketamine because the cops told him, put this guy down. He's crazy. Or, there's been a lot of calls like that where medics are doing, weird things. When we stopped backboarding everybody, right? I mean, there was a long period of time where if you didn't backboard somebody and somebody had more than 20 years on, they were going to tear you apart for not backboarding somebody. But the new science and the new research says don't do it. So my advice to a new medic is stand your ground. Do what's right by the patient, and don't let anybody tell you anything different, because at the very least, you're going to get yelled at by somebody in the middle of the street like I did. But at the most, you're going to end up with murder charges against you because you're letting a police officer dictate patient care. And that's no way that you want to be. So stand your ground, always advocate for the patient and do what's right by them. And I think you'll be okay.
And dude, it's solid advice. And like you hit on a couple of points, it's hard when you're the younger medic, like myself. I'm young in general, I will say that. But also, like, I haven't even hit my year marker as a paramedic. And so to be able to, like, look at another older medic and to say, like, no, I'm doing this, it takes guts. And
It does.
I fully believe it's not until you have that moment where, because you didn't go with your own gut, it ended up in like worse patient care and or outcome. Until you have that moment, you're gonna potentially keep bowing down. But kind of like you're saying, it shouldn't come to that moment. Like, go ahead, understand where you stand, and I mean, on the totem pole, years of experience versus your own credentials should not be the same thing, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And there are a lot of guys out there that are doing outdated things that they shouldn't be doing anymore. And I would argue that younger, newer medics are probably better prepared for advanced patient care than somebody that's been doing the job for 30 years. Now, there are some great medics that have been out there 20, 30 years, and I'm not taking anything away from them, but it's the guys that got their medic card and then never opened a magazine, never went to a conference, never read a book, never read an article, that are still doing the same thing they were doing 20 years ago. And the field has evolved. So just because you're a new medic, it doesn't diminish any of your capabilities or your knowledge. And the bottom line is, if you're the medic in the back of the ambulance, that's your patient. You're the lead medic on that call. If somebody else wants to take over patient care, well, then you go ahead and drive to the hospital and put them in the back of the ambulance, because now it's their patient, and let them do what they're going to do. But what are you really doing for the patient at that point too, if you know what they're doing is wrong or not the latest and greatest?
Especially when you want to look at legal aspects, you got that hierarchy that if you hand your level of care to a lower level provider, it's actually a form of abandonment, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is. You can't hand an ALS patient to an EMT. I'm talking about just two medics, but yeah, even at that point, if you're handing off patient care to somebody that's not going to treat to the current standard of care, a good lawyer can attack that as well. And I don't know if you would call it abandonment, but it certainly is not meeting the standard of care. And there's, there could possibly be some liability. I'm not a legal expert. I wouldn't, know where to begin that conversation. If nothing else, morally, you're not doing the right thing for your patient.
Yeah. It might be negligence, but either way. I think I know the answer, but if you could change it all, if you could go back to younger you, tell yourself, do better, whatever, would you still take this path and go into EMS? Why or why not?
I would. I think it is a phenomenal career. So the last job I had in New York before I moved, I was a medic for the Nassau County Police Department, and so right now I'd be retired with a full pension. So I think if I could have done anything different, I would have stayed in New York. I would have stayed on that job. I left for the right reasons, and while I do regret a little bit that I'm not there anymore for the perks of being able to be retired, at the time it was 2002 when we moved down to Georgia. I was in New York for 9/11, and that affected my family. My wife was pregnant with my daughter at the time. My family had never seen me wear body armor, and I had body armor on that day. So, and while in the grand scheme of things, I was in no danger at all. I was on the island. There was a lot of uncertainty that day, but that was kind of the impetus for us to move out of New York and do something different. But I think if I could talk to younger Phil, I would say just stick it out, stay here, work the job, because I really did, out of all the stuff that I did in EMS, that was the job that I loved the most. Being a police medic for Nassau County.
Fair point. Go ahead and tell me, where can listeners find you at? Like, your social media, your handles, usernames, whatever you want to call them. And also put in a plug, where can we donate to your cause at?
So I don't want any money, so you don't have to donate. If you want to support the podcast, I have a Patreon page. You can give us a couple bucks, but it's really not necessary. I'm not asking anybody for money. I end up losing money for every episode I put out, and I'm perfectly okay with that because I believe in the work that I'm doing. The best way to find us is storiesfromtheroadpodcast.com. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, I think we have all of our social media links listed there, so you can find us. That's also, we have a listener page, so you can find all the major podcast platforms, and we're on everything from Apple to Spotify to, all kinds of things. So we're easily found. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on TikTok, which is kind of silly, but I figure what the heck, I make some videos once in a while. But we're out there. I think storiesfromtheroadpodcast.com is definitely the easiest way to find me. And if you want to throw a couple of bucks at the podcast, I appreciate it, but it's certainly not necessary. And I'm not going to stop doing what I'm doing because, nobody supports me monetarily, and that's okay. I think the work is worth the few bucks that I pay to produce it.
Phil's not going to tell you to, but I will. You should donate. It's for a worthy cause. 20 out of 10. You should. I did. You should. Dude, you got anything else?
No, it's kind of surreal. And what I will say is that I think we are doing a really good job of building a community. There's other folks that I talk to that have podcasts or that are very active on social media and are supporting law enforcement and firefighters and EMS folks and dispatchers. And everybody's got this very similar narrative. We talk about the line of duty deaths. We talk about the lack of benefits and we talk about, the stress. I think we're starting to get to a point where we're seriously talking about normalizing mental health for first responders. And I am so tired of, I'm so tired of the suicides. I'm so tired of departments not supporting their people or members of departments being scared or being uncomfortable asking for help. So I think the work that I'm doing is just a small piece of it, but I think all of us collectively that are talking about first responder stories and having these conversations, I think we're starting to finally make a difference. And, if I'm a small piece of that, then I'm really happy and honored to be a part of that. But, we have men and women that go out there every single day, risk their lives, risk their mental health, put their families on hold while they're out doing a job. And, I think we need to do a better job supporting them as a group. So, if anything, if you're a first responder, by all means, create that network, join into that network, talk to other first responders, talk about the calls that you've run, talk about how it affects you, and have those conversations. And if you're not a first responder, but you know one, don't ask them what their day, what they saw. Don't ask them about their worst call, but ask them how they're doing. And, maybe that's where we start a conversation, and maybe that's where you realize that, we're not always doing so well. And the other thing, or the last thing that I'll add, is when you see someone who is acting out of character, check on them, because that's probably when they're struggling the most and they're just not asking for help. We're really good at helping other people. We are really bad at getting help for ourselves. So if you know a first responder that's just not doing well, check on them.
Absolutely. Well said. Dude, I can't top any of that. So if you ain't got anything else, I'm good.
All right. Well, I got a football game to watch. So I want to thank you really quick for having me on. It's interesting being a guest on a podcast, but I like sharing my story, and I don't get to do it a whole lot because I'm sharing everybody else's story. So thank you for having me on your podcast, and thank you for allowing me a platform to talk about myself a little bit. And I hope I didn't sound like an idiot, but I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to do this. So I just want to extend a heartfelt thank you for allowing me to.
No, dude, you've been fantastic. The honor has been completely all mine. So thank you very much, Phil. Appreciate you. Y'all go find Phil. He's doing awesome stuff, and only the best to come. So with that.
So guys, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, future topic ideas, please email me at 22athelipspodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's 22athelipspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks. Never stop learning, and be safe out there, friends.
whatever happens, happens. It'll be fine.
Okay. Professional. I dressed up for this and everything. So like
I dressed up too. I didn't take my work shirt
you
off.
did. I dig the shirt. I dig the shirt. Looks very nice.
No, I didn't go to the gym today because freaking daylight savings time is killing me, or whatever it is. The coming off the day. I don't know what it is, but man,
I just know the fallback.
I was tired and hungry all day. It was